Today in this podcast, I had something completely different in mind, and that is what is known as the quote-unquote Indian problem in the United States of America. Now, just by virtue of the words that I'm using alone, especially those of y'all motherfucking fake woke jokes that get upset about everything, the words Indian problem alone are gonna be like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? How is being an Indian, a quote-unquote Indian, right, a fucking problem? This motherfucker got some splaining to do, right? That's my terrible fucking Rick whatever from fucking I Love Lucy, right? Impersonation. But the explaining is simple. This quote unquote problem started again the moment that European colonizers set foot here on Turtle Island. And the problem is simple. I want to take this land, but there are people, namely the quote unquote Indians. Fucking how dumb was Christopher Columbus, for reals? You're like, Jesus, I can't fucking get over how I hate that guy, right? As it's been alluded to plenty of times already before. Anyways, the quote unquote problem then is, as these fucking people who come here to Turtle Island and saying to themselves, I want this land, there's already people living on this land. And thus the problem arises. How do I make this land mine? Now, to be fair, this really wasn't much of a problem upon initial fucking contact. In fact, it wasn't even a European problem for the indigenous folks here. They're the ones that helped them survive, right? But the reason it wasn't a problem initially is not because of some fucking glorious peace and love fucking kumbaya instance that magically those people managed to get along, but because fucking 400, 500 years ago when, you know, the contact first took place, you could just kill motherfuckers and not have to worry about it, especially if you were conveniently justified, as we discussed in previous lecture podcast, by your God to do so, right? So there's no fucking problem at all. Just kill all the fucking quote unquote savage Indians that are living here and clear the way for you to develop the fucking country that you believe your God told you is your fucking God-given right to do so, right? And that was basically that was the narrative for the larger part of American history. Until that motherfucking goddamn political correctness starts to set in place, right? When it really starts to become a problem. And the politically correctness is the realization that maybe we can't just kill fucking people indiscriminately, even the ones that we don't consider to be people, right? This is the history of the United States where we're slowly but surely, very slowly, still to this day, if you ask me, for reasons we'll get to here in like about 20 minutes or so, nowhere near the case, right? But slowly but surely, if you ask the other people who differ, that these people who were historically left out from the push of history, if you will, the zeitgeist, right? From the absolute unfolding of spirit to slowly but surely become sublated into what the absolute idea of freedom was going to be here on Turtle Island, right? But even then, the ways that they were dealing with the Indian problem was still very fucking problematic. Listen, man, killing a motherfucker and then, you know, killing a motherfucker or committing genocide on their culture, it's pretty much the same thing, right? Because unfortunately, for better or for worse, I guess you could say, I say unfortunately because I like to think that we have this shared human essence and that culture is somewhat of a barrier to getting to that, right? But culture is also a beautiful thing. And when you rob somebody of their culture, it's basically like a walking death sentence, okay? And that's the whole point of this hood philosophy movement, because as much as I believe that culture is a hindrance, I also 100% agree that it's fucking important to us, right? So even though they weren't killing them anymore, the Indian problem had just morphed into a more sneak tip fucking manner where instead of killing you, we're going to take all your land, we're going to justify it through the use of treaty, and we are going to subject you to these fucking boarding schools that learn you the proper quote unquote way to be a white person in the United States of America, right? And for the longest time, that was how the quote unquote Indian problem had continued to be solved. There's fucked up stories, for instance, about how, you know, indigenous children were just stolen basically and given to white women who couldn't have kids or who never got married, for instance, right? So that those white women could raise them as their own kids. Oh man, it's fucked up. And the point that I'm trying to establish here before the podcast ends, if I don't get to it later, let me just be outwardly clear with it now, is how little has changed, okay? How we still take little brown kids like myself and probably you if you're listening to this from the hood, from the fucking reservations, from the barrios, from whatever you want to fucking refer to it as, right? and we place them in these institutional learning facilities to quote unquote teach them how to be American, right? That's still fucking an act of cultural genocide, right? But it's a way to mediate, if you will, the Indian problem, because now you don't have these people who are so fucking attached to their land. You don't have these people who are so attached to their culture, to their history, to their knowledge base, etc. Now you can just, link them, if you will, to use the parlance of the lecture of the podcast for today. You can link them to that dominant culture which you're attempting to establish, and then by doing so, rid yourself of any sort of resistance that would come from them, because they no longer identify with their indigenous culture, for instance, but rather with the oppressor culture, the dominant culture, the American culture, to be explicitly clear, right? But even then, you still have a motherfucking problem. And that problem is that as we continue along, I wasn't fucking there, right? But as they continued along the westward expansion, they encounter more and more of these, indigenous peoples, the likes of which we already discussed in the previous lecture, okay? So not only do they have to continue to do this process, but as we discussed in the previous podcast lecture, fucking figure it out, right? You know what I'm trying to say, bro. As we discussed in the previous podcast, they had to build a border, right? And this is where the Indian problem really gets fucking fun, if it hasn't already been fun, right? But for me, it's where it really gets interesting. And the reason why, obviously, is because as a Chicanx person, I am fucking directly impacted by it, bro, right? And how am I impacted by it? Well, as the previous fucking podcast discussed, where they drew the Mexican border, bro, just by virtue of where they drew the Mexican border. And this is where ideally, historically at least, the Indian problem has come to an end. How did it come to an end? Because it's not because, unfortunate for the European colonizers, right? I'm sure this is exactly what they wanted, but unfortunately for them, motherfucker, we survived, right? We're still here, Nican Tlaca, baby, the people of this land, or in whatever way your personal indigenous, community refers to it as, okay? We're still here, right? So the problem, if you will, was never solved. We're still fucking right here. Never went away, okay? But another way that allegedly it got solved for them is because, well, you built a border and the ones on the north side of the border were Indian still. So a little bit of a problem, right? But the ones on the south of the border, Cipiri Gonzalez, all that kind of stuff, right? Are now Mexicans. So you rid yourself, you at least halved the Indian problem by creating the quote unquote global south, right? Global south, by making the ones who are south of the border fucking Mexican and all the other countries that live south of the American border, right? But if you ask most people who don't have any comprehension of different cultures and different languages, of the nuances of, and the idiosyncrasies between different people, they'll say just they speak Spanish and they're brown, they're all motherfucking Mexican. Who cares, right? That's why I know me personally, I'm sure you have too. You hear these people who say shit like, damn, stop speaking Mexican, yo. It's like, but wait, what are you talking about? The Mexican language? No, it's just stop, okay? Anyway, so that's the Indian problem.